The British economy will shrink by 8% this year and isn't expected to recover from the fallout from COVID-19 until 2023. At least that's according to the latest report from the EY Item Club, after official figures revealed that the UK shrank by a record 20.4% in April. Joining me to discuss the economic outlook is Dr. Gerard Lyons. He's the Chief Economic Strategist at NetWealth. He's on the board of the Bank of China in the UK and is also a Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange. Jerry, great to talk to you. Now, I read your article in The Telegraph this weekend. Very, very interesting. And to you, it seems as though the first steps from the government are about keeping the virus at bay, whilst also simultaneously allowing the economy to escape recession. So I think the question that everyone really wants to understand is, what is the shape of the recovery going to look like? Are you an optimist, a glass half full, V-shaped type of recovery person, or are we in a prolonged period of weakness?
Well, hello, it's a great pleasure to be with you. I'd like to describe myself as a realist. The economy is in a deep recession, but there's no doubt that unlocking the country will bring the economy out of recession. So I think it's likely, indeed inevitable, that the economy will pick up through the second half of this year and into next. But it's difficult to predict exactly when it will get back to its pre-crisis level. My feeling is that the economy will reach the level it had at the beginning of this year by the end of next year. So recovery the second half of this year, we reached the level it was before the crisis at the end of next year. But the big issue is going to be what happens to jobs. I think we're going to see some very poor news on the unemployment front in coming months. At the same time, we have the end of the furloughing by this autumn. So unemployment may not get back to pre-crisis levels for a few years. So I think the economy will recover. In terms of output, it will be a good recovery in one respect, but in the jobs area, it's going to be far more difficult. So that will require continued policy stimulus. I would expect the Bank of England to have to keep interest rates low, to have to inject more money. I feel that the government should actually not only unlock, but also change some of its requirements, such as social distancing, to make it less. And also at the same time, I think there needs to be tax cuts to help the economy along.
Okay, so there's a lot of different points I want to unpick there. But firstly, you mentioned the fact that the government needs to relax some of these rules, including the 2-meter rule and also the 14-day quarantine. Now, we've seen today that the FTSE 100 and global markets are under pressure amid concerns about a second wave possibly coming from China. I mean, what's your assessment of the risk of a resurgence in the virus, and how could that potentially obstruct the recovery?
Yeah, well, I did some detailed work on this with Professor Ormrod of University College London. We looked at the analytical framework, epidemiological models, and added in behaviours from economics. And the reality is that when we are in a vaccine gap, as we are now, there will be localised outbreaks. And therefore, it's very important, wherever those localised outbreaks occur, that they're contained very quickly to stop the spread of the virus. The epidemiological models inevitably assume there is a second wave. But that need not occur. Indeed, whether it's in Britain or in China, indeed any other country, for the unlocking or the next phase to work well, that is keeping the virus under control while allowing the economy to recover, you need to have three things. You need to have testing, track and trace, and behaviours need to change. That is, people need to behave in a very cautious way. Spending more, hopefully, but still cautious in terms of public hygiene, social distancing. So I think it's likely, might say inevitable, that there will be localized outbreaks. Whether there's a second wave, we would have to wait and see. When one looks at the shape of the likely economic recovery, whether it's in Britain or elsewhere, the markets have been debating whether it's a V or a U shape. I think it seems to be more likely to be a U shape. But that risk of an L or a W still exists. An L, because of the high amount of unemployment, the economy remains depressed. The W, if there's a second wave. I think if we unlock in the gradual way in Britain and indeed in other countries, and if behaviours do change, then I think it's more likely to be a U-shaped recovery, both here and indeed overseas.
So what's your view on how the Chancellor's dealt with the economic fallout from COVID so far? And what are some of the key fiscal measures that the government needs to take from here to support the recovery?
Well, the fiscal stimulus has been significant in the UK. Initially, it was too complex, but then the Chancellor made it easier for funds to be accessed. Last week, the OECD provided global analysis, shall we say, of what was happening. And what was remarkable there was how the UK fiscal stimulus, even though we think it's sizable, and it is, was relatively small compared to some other countries. So what we've seen both in Britain and elsewhere is that for the bulk of the last decade, monetary policy has been the shock absorber. Interest rates have been pushed lower. Central banks have seen their balance sheets increase. In this crisis, while monetary policy has also been accommodating, it's been fiscal policy that's done more of the heavy lifting. And here in the UK, I think what's important is that having eased fiscal policy, the Chancellor continues to remain accommodative. What do I mean by that? In an environment of low inflation, low interest rates and low yields, there's scope for UK government borrowing to remain high. And we must not have austerity and we should not have tax increases. So having done a lot so far, I think the Chancellor needs to continue to actually keep his foot on the accelerator, so to speak. And indeed, one or two sectors of the economy, very important in the UK, hospitality sectors, leisure sectors, their business models will not be able to return to normal while social distancing exists and while there's no vaccine. So those sectors might need to have continued fiscal support, while fiscal support might be pulled away from those other areas that are returning to normal. So it's a complex picture, but fiscal policy so far has been accommodating. It needed to be, and I think it will have to remain accommodating for some time.
Yeah, so it seems as though, like you said, fiscal policy has been doing the heavy lifting. And on the monetary side, it feels as though there's been quite a lot of fatigue, really, ever since the financial crisis with ever shrinking interest rates. I mean, what do you think the role of the Bank of England should be in helping to support the economic recovery? And what are you expecting from the Bank of England on Thursday?
Yeah, well, I think the backdrop is where I think the government needs to outline an economic vision and so that people can plan ahead. But in the very near term, monetary and fiscal policy need to be both consistent with one another and accommodating. Now, short-term interest rates are already very low in the UK. I personally don't think interest rates need to go negative at the short end. But I'd like to see the Bank of England focus on what I would call pegs and regs, in terms of pegging 10-year yields close to zero and focusing on easing macro-prudential regulations, which have not received as much scrutiny maybe as they could have done. So I think the Bank of England needs to be accommodating. In terms of this meeting this Thursday, if there is to be any further policy easing, which I think there will be, then I think it's more likely to be on the QE, the quantitative easing front. So what we have basically is a backdrop where the Bank of England, having cut short-term interest rates, will likely outline that short-term rates will stay low for some time, much as the US Federal Reserve did last week. I'd like to see them try and focus on basically 10-year yields remaining low, but they may not go that route. I'd like to see them focusing on macro-prudential regulations being eased further. I don't think they will go that route. I think they will go down the route in the near term of further quantitative easing, and along with other central banks, see their balance sheets increase, which will give a prop and support to financial markets at the moment.
Okay, let's talk about Brexit for a second, which seems to have been slightly pushed off the agenda because of the coronavirus, but nonetheless remains very much front and center as a priority for the government. I mean, there's an interesting article this week in The Economist basically saying that Boris Johnson's government needs to take the option to prolong the transition because, firstly, Brexit already happened in January, and secondly, Britain potentially actually could pay less into the EU budget now that it's out of the common agricultural policy. I mean, what's your response to these arguments? Because I know you're not a fan of the transition or extending any kind of transition.
Well, the argument, as you've explained it, I haven't read that particular article, but I'm aware of the argument. No, I wouldn't agree with that. I think it's quite clear that the UK needs to not extend the transition period. There's no doubt that this virus has weakened the UK economy, is exposed its soft underbelly, so to speak. But at the same time, this virus has also weakened many of the continent's economies. Spain, Italy, France, in particular, have been quite weak. What that means, in my mind, is that we should approach it from a sense that economically it makes complete sense for both the UK and the EU to reach a deal before the end of the year. The UK is not going to ask for a transition. Remaining in a transition leaves the UK exposed to new EU regulation and rules without us having a vote, a veto, or a voice on those. Also, I think, contrary to what you said, we would pay more we were to stay in an extended transition. Now, therefore, against that backdrop, it makes complete economic sense, and one would argue political sense, for both the UK and the EU to reach a deal. And I think as the clock ticks down towards the end of the year, there will likely be a deal between both sides. So no transition extension. Indeed, the pre-crisis economic agenda of levelling up the economy, not having a Brexit transition, and moving towards net carbon zero economy, all those important features remain, in my mind, very much in place, even after this virus.
Now, Unilever last week decided to pick London over Rotterdam as its corporate headquarters. Alok Sharma, the business secretary, he said that this was a clear vote of confidence in the UK. But we also heard from the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, who said that London should not be a European financial hub after Brexit. I mean, do you think London will be able to maintain its prominent position within the financial system?
Well, there's no doubt that London is and will remain, in my view, the global financial centre. Indeed, it will continue to compete against New York, against new centres in East Asia. There's no doubt that within Europe, London has the dominant lead in terms of major financial centres. It's always possible one or two others may gain relatively. But I think when one looks at the whole skill set here in London, London will benefit. And indeed, you mentioned Unilever. I wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times 2 years ago about Unilever, why it should, and indeed, I thought would choose London in terms of dual listed companies. There were 7 at that time. That wasn't so much Brexit linked in my view, even though then 2 years ago when people said it was choosing Holland and last week when it was choosing London, it's much more than that. It's about the whole infrastructure in terms of the financial sector here in London. And what London and the city needs to do is remain internationally competitive. At the same time, I think there's a strong need in the UK post this virus to ensure the city continues to provide the finance needed for the UK economy. And there still is a massive shortfall, a funding gap for small, medium-sized firms in the UK, which last year was estimated by the officials to be £22 billion. So in terms of the City of London, I think contrary to what the politicians on the continent say, I think London will remain the major financial centre in Europe. I think it needs to continue to remain a place that's attractive for people to do business from as well as in. And I think it's also important from a domestic UK perspective that we see more of those pools of capital being directed towards longer term investment here in the UK.
All right, that's all we have time for. Gerard, thank you so much for your time. Just quickly, before letting you go, you'll be speaking at the Recovery Summit this week, is that right?
Yes, later this week. So the Recovery Summit has a whole list of different speakers. Professor Yunus, the Nobel laureate, and myself are having a discussion together on Thursday about how the world economy needs to change. And indeed, in that, I make the point that each year in Davos, the catchphrase is committed to improving the state of the world. Sometimes I feel it's committed to improving not the state of the world, but committed to ensuring that nothing changes and that we do need to change. So at the Recovery Summit, I'm on one session with Professor Yunus. Then I'm also outlining what I think will happen to the world economy, what will change and what will not change as a result of this virus.
Excellent stuff. And you can watch Gerard's talk and find out more about the Recovery Summit at www.therecoverysummit.com. Thank you so much to my guest, Dr. Gerard Lyons, Chief Economic Strategist at NetWealth. He's on the board of the Bank of China in the UK and is also a Senior Fellow at Policy Exchange. I'm Victoria Scholar, and thank you for watching IGTV.
For more videos like these, subscribe to our YouTube channel, IG UK, and make sure to follow us on Twitter. We're at IGTV.